Welcome everybody, thanks for joining us. We're going to give it about 30 more seconds to get started as some people are still filing into the room, so please do bear with us and we will get started momentarily. Well, folks, I think that'll suffice. It's 2:01 Eastern Time. Welcome to all of you who have taken some time to join us today. My name is Nick Astor with South Pole. I am in charge of marketing for North America here at South Pole. This is actually our first event of Climate Week. We're very excited to see you all. It's a bummer that we can't be in person in New York this year. I'm hoping that'll happen again next year, but in the meantime, the good thing about being virtual is we're able to invite many of you from far more disparate locations. So I think we may wind up with an even richer conversation. Real quick, for those of you not familiar with South Pole, we are a sustainability consulting company and climate project developer. We've been around since 2006, founded and headquartered in Zurich. Since then, we've grown to be a truly global operation in dozens of countries on all continents. We work with hundreds of companies, organizations, and the public sector on reducing their carbon footprints and many other sustainability issues. This is not unique to Climate Week. We actually host virtual events throughout the year. You can find out many more of those events by checking out our website, southpole.com/events. And I'm obviously going to screw up the PowerPoint, but let's not worry about that. You guys know the drill. We're all virtual. We're all working from home, so please excuse unusual noises, surprise visits by children, and so on. If you do have questions, we're going to have plenty of Q&A at the end of this chat, but you can ask questions in advance by typing them into the box that you should see to your right. A few of you have already asked us some questions via Twitter. Thanks for that. We'll be sure that we get to it. Without further ado, today's conversation at hand, we are talking about risk, resilience, and recovery. We all know that the travel sector in particular is taking quite a beating from the COVID-19 crisis this year. We believe that there are things that we can learn from this crisis that may prepare us against the coming crisis of climate change, or perhaps even help us to prevent some of the worst effects of that coming crisis. We are excited to be joined today by some real leaders in this sector. We have Sara Bogdan. She is the head of sustainability at JetBlue. We also have Conor Ryan. He is a naturalist with Lindblad Expeditions. He can tell you a thing or two about cetaceans. Whelan is here as well. He's the director of sustainability at Natural Habitat Adventures, and very excited to be introducing Muireann Gibbons Neff. She is our regional lead for consulting North America at South Pole, and she will be moderating today's panel. So without further ado, I will simply drop out the share screen. I'm going to turn it over to Muireann to get us rolling. And as I mentioned, please do feel free to ask your questions in the sidebar. We'll get to them in roughly 35 minutes or so.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nick, and welcome everyone. Very excited to have you here for this first virtual event of Climate Week. So as Nick mentioned, we're here today to talk about risk, resiliency, what COVID can teach us, and the travel industry. So COVID is top of mind for everyone. Obviously the hot topic of 2020. It is the focal point of this conversation, but we want to talk about the real intersection points of climate change and travel. In a way, you can think of COVID as a dress rehearsal for a much bigger and longer term problem that is climate change, and perhaps no sector has been as hard hit the past few months as the travel sector. So with that, I'm going to start handing it over and ask some questions of our fantastic panelists to dig into this a little deeper and probe the intersection points of all these issues. So a first question for all the folks here is just in general, how's business? How bad is the hit you've been taking? How has it evolved as we approach the end of the summer? And In order of folks as they're appearing on my screen, Court, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, it's tough. Like you said, it's one of the industries hit hardest. So, being mostly in international travel, it's been hard. We have taken this as an opportunity to shift to more domestic travel. We do a lot of great stuff in U.S. national parks. It's also given us ability to think outside the box and launch new trips for later in 21 and 22 that we've never done before. We just sold out on a Russian train expedition that we wouldn't normally do something like that, but it's really exciting. So we're able to use this as an opportunity to explore a new product. But it is, yeah, it's certainly tough, especially when you think of so many countries depending on tourism, especially countries in Africa for safaris that have quite literally zero inbound tourists right now.
Absolutely, thanks. And Sara, from the airline perspective, how's it going?
Sure, thanks, Muireann, thanks, Nick, and thanks to those listening in. So, gosh, obviously this is a very challenging time for the airlines. There was a point earlier this year we were running about 10% of all of our flights, and of those flights, I think we had a handful of people on them. So it's of course been very tough. Not to without sugarcoating, I mean, U.S. airlines are still burning through millions of dollars a day, and so ultimately we do need travel to rebound at some point. But that said, I think from a positive perspective, we're now well past the initial shock phase. And then at least here at JetBlue, the last few months have transitioned to thinking about how we emerge from this crisis as a different and stronger airline. So for us, that's included some really cool game-changing moves, such as like dozens of new routes and expansions in new cities, but it also includes, of course, this applies to sustainability as well. So we know our industry needs to continue to address our emissions problem. And so this has remained top of mind for our leaders, and we're working all of that into our recovery plans.
Fantastic, thanks. And Conor.
Hi, yeah, we've obviously been not operating our ships since March, but we've been certainly very busy behind the scenes, and we're concerned about our local partners on the ground and the effects of under-tourism, I suppose you could say. We've worked in places like Galapagos since the late 1960s, and that's a place where businesses are really, really badly affected by the pandemic. And there's something like 80% of the industry there is reliant on tourism, which is obviously not happening at the moment. So we're concerned for our partners in the Galapagos and elsewhere, Falklands and similar places. Like I say, we've not been operating our ships since March. I got off the last ship that was sailing in late March, and we haven't gone to sea since then, but we're really excited about starting up again as soon as we can.
Wonderful. And another question for all of you, very real impacts here, certainly a hard hit. What are you hearing from your customers now, even in just the past few weeks? Are people clamoring to start traveling again, or is there still a degree of hesitancy given the current situation?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in and start. Yes to both those. Like most human behavior, there's a bell curve. You have your early adopters, you have usually the middle, and then you have people that are going to kind of tail behind at the end, and then you have different groups within that. So we're seeing kind of everything. There will be people that probably won't travel for quite some time. There are people that are clamoring to say, gosh, as soon as Kenya opens or as soon as Uganda opens, we want to go on safari. Put us at the top of the list. We're going to go. We want to go. So we will have that. And I think that that's going to help pave the way for tourism industry to sort of have that proof of concept that it's possible to do it safely, possible to do it responsibly, possible to have host countries welcome us and do so responsibly themselves. Because you can look at the demand from travelers, and that's one thing. You can look at the ability for an operator to do a trip, that's another thing. But really the biggest thing is the host countries have to be comfortable with it. So that's something that we're very, very closely looking at. And fortunately, I'm getting updates every day, if not every week, of countries that are on schedule to open safely with protocols, how immigration lines are going to work, how airports are going to work, how transfers are going to work, et cetera, from a lot of countries around the world. So it is, there's a lot of optimism to be had. For the first time in a while, I'm seeing a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that there are definitely, in the grand scheme of things, of all the world, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of those early adopters that will pave way to the majority of travelers. It's happening. It will happen soon.
Great.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, completely agreed with Court. I think yes to both. Many of us, I'm sure, in the panel and those listening are very eager to travel, of course, waiting for the right time for us personally. But pre-COVID, I used to start talks like these by speaking to like the value aviation brings to society, and from generating millions of aviation-related jobs and building a global economy and allowing people to explore the world and new cultures. And I'd say all that, and now having been unable to travel for essentially a year or 6 months, however long it's been, it really brings new meaning to that sentiment. I think it's honestly been personally painful for all of us to have to, cancel trip after trip. And so I think from the JetBlue perspective, we get it. People want to travel. Often people need to travel. But from a sustainability perspective, no one wants this additional unintended consequence that comes with it today, and that's emissions. And so, we get that, and we're doing a lot of work, which I'm excited to speak to soon.
And from our side in Lindblad, our customers have definitely been very keen to get back out, and they have great confidence in our ability to get them back into nature in remote places. And I suppose proof of that really is that more than 50% of trips our customers that were affected by the pandemic have opted for future travel credit with us, which is always a good sign. And so there's confidence there, and we've had several tries at starting up again, but the time wasn't right. So we're definitely answering their call as best we can to get them back on the water and get them back to the remote places that we visit.
That's great. Well, it's nice to hear encouraging and positive feedback from the market these days. We think of that theme of resiliency, and it sounds like people themselves are resilient when it comes to travel and bouncing back, which is always a good thing. So thinking about this theme of climate change and sustainability and the parallels, are you seeing parallels between COVID-19 and climate change as kind of the next great big risk or the next great big business disruptor? And do you feel that narrative has grown at all over the past 7 months as a result of COVID?
Yeah, great question. I think that the narrative needs to continue to grow. I think people won't understand impacts until they've felt a bit of it, and we're feeling it right now. I think that there are so many parallels to make. A global disruptor that you can't hide from. That's it. That's what we're happening right now. That's what's going to happen in the future. It's a thing that we all at this panel of the audience, we have a vested interest and responsibility as people in the travel industry to mitigate it. And we want the world to be impacted. At the end of the day, I often say that this whole argument of the controversy of climate change and whatnot, it's not. Let's just not say it's a human caused thing. Let's just acknowledge that the science is out there, the evidence is out there, but it's a human cause or it's a human problem. Like, we are going to be the people that will ultimately suffer most out of drastic change. So I think that we alone have the power to minimize it. And I think that we're definitely getting a taste of it right now as to how this idea of tragedy of the commons, one thing that happens in one part of the world, can affect the entire world within a matter of very, very little time. And the same is going to be true of climate change and various feedback effects.
Yeah, I so completely agree. This is the exact conversation I've been having within the ESG community, and then relaying, to my leadership. 2020 has been a true test on business resilience. Something I keep thinking back to is, so in 2018, we released our first SASB and TCFD report. So that's a lot of letters, but it's essentially our investor-aligned ESG report. And so through that, we generate a list of key environmental and social risks that are material to JetBlue. And I look back at the report, and one of the items on the list there is pandemics, and specifically how they can be worsened by climate change. And sometimes when you do these risk assessments, it can maybe just feel like words on a page, particularly something like a pandemic that was considered previously a low probability, high impact risk. And now here we are in the middle of the aviation industry's greatest financial crisis as a result of the manifestation of that risk. So it makes you look at everything on that list with a different perspective. What if everything else happened in the next 6 months at the same time? What about the high probability risks like climate change that we're already seeing the impacts of, and those are just expected to get worse? So really for us, the result is just a greater focus on short-term planning. And I think this narrative and this exact proof point of an ESG risk manifesting itself is propelling us to look more urgently at all of our risks.
And just to echo the other guys, I mean, I think there's incredible parallels in the sense that both climate change and COVID-19 are effectively invisible, but the devastating effects are very clear. And unfortunately, some places around the world have had the terrifying combination of both, wildfires and a pandemic, which is a terrifying reality in some places. And I suppose I was reflecting on it today. The immediate risk of COVID is a very personal one and very immediate. But whereas climate change can be seen as somehow distant or non-personal or at least abstract in some way and a somewhat foreign threat. But apologies to use are immune from change, and I think we're getting a sense of that from COVID-19 as well. And so, use COVID-19 as a kind of a framework for how to respond to these kind of global emergencies.
Yeah, one quick thing I'm just going to add there is I think there's another similarity which may not be immediately obvious, is that both climate change and pandemics are not unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. I mean, for the last billion years of modern life, these things have happened. Climate's changed and warmed much more drastically than it is right now. Pandemics, diseases come and gone. It's not like we're facing something that's never happened before. That's facing us. And it's facing us in a different time span, in a different scale, and a different immediacy. We're trying to save ourselves is really what this whole debate is about. And these things have happened. The Earth will do just fine in another 10 million to 10 billion years. But we're looking after our own survival is really the key. And there's a very close parallel on both of those.
Absolutely. It's a great point, Bogdan. Really hits home to just the human aspect of it, right? We're all survivalists at the end of the day. So thank you for these perspectives. Sara, I want to ask you a targeted question. JetBlue, we know you're doing a lot on fuel efficiency and emissions and, some of those flagship topics and initiatives, but what about engaging the passengers? What have you done to get people caring about issues like sustainability and climate change? How is it working? And, is that shifting at all now that you have fewer people on the physical airplanes?
Yeah, look, I mean, the good news is people previously did care a lot. And I think, well, if you Google, for example, how to reduce your personal contribution to climate change, you'll often come up with like this list of ways you can do that. And often highest on the list is stop flying or fly less. And so like I have a lot of thoughts on this. First, of course, like any industry, some companies are more engaged in sustainability than others. So I've never liked that idea of saying all flights are equal. But big picture, there is truth here, of course. As an industry, we've made a lot of recent improvements in our emissions management, but the flight shaming movement exists because there still is a significant piece that we contribute, and we need to keep improving. And so for JetBlue, we really wanted to make a big move to show our customers we get it, and we're acting as fast and as best as we can. So through that, in July, so post-COVID, we became the first US airline to voluntarily offset all of our domestic emissions, and in which is South Pole has been a key partner to us. So thank you very much for helping us source credible offsets and be a key partner through that. But also, it was really important to us to pair this announcement with another, and that's we're starting to fly regularly, so on an ongoing basis, every single day on sustainable aviation fuel out of San Francisco International Airport. And so this is a drop-in fuel that reduces emissions up to 80%. And again, it was really important that we made these announcements simultaneously to say, look, carbon offsetting is a solution for now as we build up these lower carbon solutions. Ultimately, I wish we could put SAF, as we call sustainable aviation fuel, in every single one of our flights, but there's a lot of challenges today around supply and cost. But ultimately, I say all this because, like, again, we get it. JetBlue has essentially been an airline that tries to give our customers what they want. And in our early days, that was more legroom and TVs and Wi-Fi. And now our customers, they want their emissions to be handled, and they want to feel that they can travel without being shamed. And that extends both to our leisure individual passengers and then to our businesses who historically have done a lot of travel, and they have their own emissions targets, and their air travel emissions is starting to be a growing piece of the pie. And so all this to say, JetBlue's perspective has been to step up and say, we know we get it, we're doing everything that we can, and then join us in that conversation, and we can partner together to bolster this even further.
Fantastic. It's really interesting. And, that connection with customers is so important. Curious, I want to pivot to you, Conor, on that theme. A lot of your work has focused on using travel as a force for good, and whales as well, very interestingly. So how has your study of the natural world and these animal species, informed an approach to travel and enabled connection with customers in a very different way, from an airline, I'd imagine. But do you find that those connection points help make these abstract, seemingly distant concepts like climate change come more to life and engage people more?
Great questions. Yeah, I mean, they're the questions I kind of ask myself every day at work. So in some ways, as a naturalist, working on the ground or at sea on our ships, in some ways my job to enthuse people about whales is very easy because everyone loves whales and no one doubts that they exist, although they can be hard to find. But what really tells me I've done my job right at Lindblad is when a guest comes and tells me that their travel experience has really changed their perspective about their environment and their place in the environment. And I know some of the travelers who perhaps would be initially maybe agnostic about our capacity as humans to disrupt the environment on a global scale and affect natural climate systems. But occasionally, after traveling with us, their perspective really has shifted on that. And that's just because some of the places we visit are so jaw-dropping, and so beautiful and so vast, and to think that they're also vulnerable is an amazing thing that you kind of have to experience yourself. I get as excited about whale barnacles and whale poop as I do about whales themselves. So I'm interested in the systems, and whales are kind of my gateway drug to becoming interested in the environment. And when you have an inroads like something like whales or penguins or the cute things, and that's when you have people, that's when they're listening, and that's when you can tell them about the intricacies in the environment, the way everything is connected, and things that you might think are trivial can be very, very important. And so things like, did you know that whale poop contains 10 million times more iron than the surrounding seawater? And you think, well, why does that matter? Well, because iron is the nutrient which supercharges the ecosystem. And without that injection of iron from whales, we don't get the sea fertilized. If the sea isn't fertilized, we get less whales, we get less fish for ourselves. So kind of drawing all those links together. And I think the ability to do that and also to tie it in with climate is very, very important. And that's our job as naturalists in Lindblad, is to kind of point that out in an interesting way, and not to proselytize, but to just show people what's at stake and what could be lost. And just on that last point about whales and climate, we showed an amazing capacity to recover whales. We nearly lost them. They were on the brink of extinction. And this global effort to recover them has been incredible, and I think unparalleled, really. It was basically the start of the green movement, if you like. And we need to kind of tap back into that energy when it comes to climate. And so whales are recovering all the time in most populations, but actually now projections show that recovery is starting to slow and will actually reverse in 100 years' time for most whales because of climate change. And so these things are linked, and certainly how we need to change our behavior and consider how our impact, our behavior on the other side of the planet is affecting a whale, a penguin, the climate, even though it's out of sight, out of mind.
Fascinating. Thank you. And Court, your career has also focused on ecotourism, and you'd started mentioning this earlier in the first few questions, but can you elaborate more on these new forms of engagement or connection or kind of new types of travel that you're thinking about as a result of the events of this year, and also thinking about that sustainability long term? How do you continue?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I love what you're saying, Conor. I mean, you cannot save what you do not love, and you cannot love what you do not know. I think we're in the business of getting people to know the environment, to know the world, to know the things that are still left out there. And what you said, the world has an amazing regenerative ability. So we just got to give it that time to breathe. As far as experiences in travel right now, as it pertains to COVID, so we're obviously not doing a heck of a lot of travel. Of the travel we are doing more locally here in the US, we're being very, very safe, very diligent. One thing that we've always had in Lindblad as well is the smallest groups in our respective industries. Smallest boats. In our case, the smallest African safaris and polar bear safaris. Where 8, 10, 12 people. That's gonna be like the natural trend, I think, going forward, is people will gravitate to that. Ultimately, you kind of go back, what to do in these COVID times, to the idea, it's an old business adage of, you don't really need a 1/4-inch drill bit, you need a 1/4-inch hole. The drill bit gives you the hole. So, travel, yes, travel is fun for the sake of travel, but what you really are looking for is worldly education, worldly experiences, new experience, transformational experiences, new education, learning about the world just as much as you learn about yourself. So in these times, we're able to do that quite a bit by these daily webinars that we're actually doing, very similar formats to this, where we're getting our expedition leaders around the world, we're getting World Wildlife Fund scientists from around the world to join us digitally and give discussions and lectures and virtual safaris about where they're at and what they're doing and what they're most passionate about, and keeping that connection to nature, making sure that bridge doesn't go away in this time. There are lots of other outfits that are doing these interesting virtual safaris where they're taking game cams and 360 cams and driving around the Serengeti and the Masai Mara and all sorts of places. I've seen some really unique things. Another thing that people are doing in this time is they're using this time to really up the training of staff, of expedition leaders, of guides, of their scientists, and use this time with a little bit of downtime to get them, when travel does emerge, that we are positioned the very best to emerge as the authorities on nature travel, the authorities on whatever trip you are doing as a travel and tour operator. But ultimately, travel will come back. It's what we're all hoping for. We know it. When previous things like this have happened, it's come back absolutely rolling. Right now, the struggle is, well, to do some of these cool sustainability things like carbon offsetting, like the world's first zero waste adventure that we led last year. They're not going to help the bottom line necessarily, but we can't lose sight of these moonshots, even though the finances may be a little bit of a strain right now. So my recommendation to the travel industry is, during this time, while we have a little bit of time, re-up the training, keep people connected to nature virtually using all these brilliant new tools that we have nowadays with live time cams from Africa and Asia. It's amazing stuff. And then keeping things on a simmer that are indeed important to the future of travel. Again, we all have a vested interest to keep the world as it is, keeping nature as it is. And the more we can invest in sustainability and more we're ready for it once travel gets kicking again, I think the better the world and all travel companies will be because of it. It's our product.
That's great. Perhaps a question for everyone here, as things do recover, what are you going to be doing differently, to keep up these levels of preparedness for risks and learn from everything that you've been describing and applying in 2020?
Well, I'll jump in.
So,
I could go over all sorts of, operational stuff and, our security protocols, like the 6-point protocol for COVID and how we're dealing with vans. But that's, I'm not going to talk too much about that. You can read that on our website. The main thing I think is the sustainability front. Like that's what my world is. How is it going to look? And I will just simply say that the travel industry has been primed for sustainability for a long time. It's been growing and growing. I can't tell you how many companies I talk to on a weekly basis that want to go carbon neutral in the travel industry, and I help advise on that. What does it look like? How does South Pole work for all that? But I think the main thing is just making sure it's still there, making sure that you're ready to jump back into it, and then also knowing that it's going to be the newest, biggest trend as we go forward. Basically, from what I said just a moment ago, it's our main product. We absolutely must focus on that.
And at Lindblad, we're building more efficient ships. We're offering longer duration expeditions, as suggested by our new ship, which is named the National Geographic Endurance. So we'll be able to go for longer trips and further deeper into remote places. We're designing more resources and lab space on our ships to up our game in terms of citizen science projects. And with the time that all of the field staff and naturalists and crew have had ashore, we've been kind of delving into our citizen science data and finding some really exciting findings, and some research involving whale movements, for example, which our guests and travelers have helped us piece together some migration routes for whales. And we've been using that time ashore as well to group together and to upskill and up our game in terms of our message on climate change. And definitely, in Lindblad, we accept that travel will never be impact free, but we should be realistic about that. But we should do our very best to carefully examine our footprint and do everything that we can to reduce it. And if we can't reduce it in certain places, then we offset it with our partners in South Pole. But certainly it's given us a chance to kind of hit the reset button and look at what we do from every which angle.
Sure, and from the JetBlue side, in terms of how this has impacted our approach to risk preparation, I think one big takeaway for us is, again, been that environmental and social issues are only rising in urgency. Conventionally, when we talk about ESG, so environmental social governance, it's referred to around protecting value in the long run, long-term risks and opportunities. But here we are in the middle of 3 massive ESG crises with the pandemic, national focus on systemic racism, and of course a rapidly warming and changing climate, and understanding these are feeding off of each other. And so for us, that also means that we're accelerating our response. And so as we address these risks and others, what we're working toward are clear short-term targets and strategies. So the aviation industry has an ambitious emissions goal to reduce our emissions by half by 2050. But now we understand, what are we doing in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, as an industry and as an individual airline? And so that's something I'm working on in the background, is essentially different roadmaps for reducing our scenarios, and then thinking how we respond. So ramping up also climate risk scenario planning. So making sure that we are as best prepared to respond to whatever scenario we end up seeing.
That's great.
And one very quick thing to add, I'm sorry about I think what it also tells us is that when we have those opportunities for the moonshot, for the big bodacious initiatives, and we have the ability to do so, i.e. pre-COVID, times are rolling good, that's when there's to do them. Like, no time like the present. So continually delaying that for when there's a better time, you never know what's around the corner. So I think that, we certainly are happy to push out some of those really big initiatives when we have the time. So I recommend that there's no perfect time, but you got to do it now.
And Court or others, curious, based on that, do you feel that there's less perhaps resistance, or it's easier to make the business cases for these types of initiatives now as a result of the current climate?
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in again. Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. And then like the biggest thing is that we have to justify it financially. I mean, there's always going to be people that don't agree with it. That's just human behavior in life. And there's always going to be people that don't really care about the environment and animals and natural settings or whatever. But there is increasingly a better and better financial case for it. It would cost us as a world about $30 trillion a year to reproduce the naturally occurring things that the ecosystem provides for us, like clean water, fertile soils, clean air. 30 trillion, that's with a T. It is financially viable to keep biodiversity intact, to keep the climate intact. I mean, that's irrespective of climate change. That's just everything in general. So I think we have to continually make that case to get everyone to understand it. And just the same reason I vie for ecotourism and conservation travel, what we're able to do is we're able to add value to these ecosystems and show people that trees that are left standing, wildlife that grazes on the savannas, they are actually 5 to 5,000 times more valuable alive than if you were to turn that into an agricultural field or somehow poach them or hunt them, something like that. So making the financial case, I think, is something that will always be there, and maybe that's a key to this current environment. But I think it's a constant.
I add to what Court said as well. I think people are receptive to messages now about the environment and about climate change in a way that perhaps they weren't before the pandemic. Because I don't know how many times I've heard people say, the colors are more vivid this year. I've noticed more birds. I've noticed more insects. I am seeing the seasons change. Because a lot of people are, stopped for long enough and stood still for long enough to notice these things. And in the same way as traveling to remote places and seeing what could potentially be lost or damaged irreparably, then people are noticing that on their own doorstep as well. And I think we need to kind of use this moment for good and kind of tap into that receptive kind of nature that people seem to be exhibiting at the moment.
I love that. Beautifully put. So a final question for all the panelists, and then maybe we'll turn it over to the audience and see if there's any Q&A. We know travel has...
Hey, Muireann, I'll jump in and tell everybody, we're getting a few questions in the little chat box on the sidebar there where it says questions. Now is your chance to start typing those questions in, and we will get through them as quickly as we can. Sorry, Muireann, go back.
No, perfect. Thank you. So we know that travel has a big footprint and has its challenges, but as everyone has noted in the course of this discussion, there are also huge upsides. So how do we strike that balance? And what would you have to say to folks who say, because of COVID and everyone is more local and staying put and footprints are down, it should stay that way? What would be your response to encourage, no, we need to continue seeing the world and getting those perspectives, and how do we balance it in a sustainable way?
So, I mean, I'll start. I think the biggest thing is you always keep your eye on the prize, always keep your eye on the fact that you have to be involved in the net positive. If you lose sight of that, if you ignore it, if you say, whatever, we're doing well, you have to make sure that you're actively striving for the net positive, because there are impacts, and it's not just emissions. It's, any foot that you lay on the soil has an impact on the environment. I mean, we can go all the way down to like the bacterial level of the soil. I mean, you have an impact. So you have to consciously, day to day, minute by minute, say, am I doing more good by being here? And I think, I could spend a whole another hour talking about that. But, ultimately, one of the things I share with audiences often is that, okay, great. So the tourism percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions is about 7%. Let's just say to 7%. Okay, great. Let's just nix that. No more tourism whatsoever. It just doesn't happen. We can't afford the 7%. You still have 93% of global greenhouse gas emissions out there. And I personally can think of no better way than the travel and tourism industry to influence the other sectors, the other 93%, the energy sector, the agricultural sector, the industry sector, the other part of travel, business travel. Like, these are the ways to influence people, to show them the world, get them with ambassadors like the folks that you have on this call today, and get them to realize there's so much beauty left in the world that's worth protecting. And that 7% does a wildly disproportionate good. As a random example, 11% is the number. Food waste itself in the world presents about 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Let's use tourism and travel to nix the rest of that stuff that we can take out, things that we can fix, be the megaphone, be the influencers. That's, I think, travel's opportunity, and I personally view responsibility as well.
It's a good question. I think, how to strike that balance. I think that's something that we have to keep asking ourselves, and certainly myself and my colleagues, we ask ourselves this question all the time. Are we balancing up the footprint versus the positive effect that we're having on people's, on their behavior or their choices of, where they invest, what they eat, how they travel, and we need to demonstrate a way, and we do demonstrate a way that travel can be a force for good. So we kind of achieve that as an ethos, I suppose, by maximizing our opportunities to inspire. And just one example I could think of was in the Arctic last year up in Svalbard, and we sailed into this bay, and one of our guests asked me, what's the name of this bay? So we went over to the chart and had a look, and the bay had no name. And the bay had no name because it didn't exist a few years ago when the chart was made. It was now what was a big lump of ice, basically, had disappeared in a matter of a couple of decades only. And this was a new bay that we were sailing into and charting as we went, and didn't have a name because it was brand new. So in those moments are shocking to people, and but also inspirational, and that you can just see the penny dropping, that the impact they're having, and the time scale that's happening. So we encourage people to kind of, I suppose, reflect on their choices when they go back home, and in that way, it goes beyond just the 2-week trip or whatever, how long the trips are. So yeah, we really hope that people, and know that people, cherish those moments and take them home with them. Also, you're talking about, Court, about the impact can be down to a microscopic level, and that there is always some impact, and we're trying to reduce that everywhere we go. Another way of thinking about impact is, well, what are the impacts on people in the places that we visit? So ethical travel as well. And something we have been working on during the COVID pandemic is increasing the vegetarian options on our ship, but also trying to get, from farm to plate, supporting local farmers and communities in the Galapagos, as an example I gave earlier, but also places like the Falklands, where we go and we get the food locally, and we're supporting the local community and helping support local jobs. And that's why we're worried about our colleagues and our partners on the ground in those places, and keen to get back and support them because they are dependent on the travel industry as well.
Yeah, I so agreed with everything that you said. I guess from the aviation perspective, I think the answer is simple from my perspective. Ultimately, decarbonize our industry. People want to travel, and I think it's our responsibility to make the balance in that people can travel, but we take away that impact. When we made our carbon neutrality announcement earlier this year, we described it as the cost of doing business. This is not something that's passed on to the customer in their ticket. It is genuinely what we perceive as, you know, our license to operate and our ability to grow. And so, look, there exists so many technologies to further drive down our emissions. And again, I said this in the beginning, our carbon offsetting does not discount all of our emissions. And that doesn't mean, great, we're done, we've solved all of travel industry's problems, but instead gives us, it's a great, important starting point. And as we build up, again, sustainable aviation fuel and introduce more and more fuel efficient aircraft, the aviation industry, I think, still suffers, of course, from this environmental stigma, but we've made so many improvements. I was reading this morning in a McKinsey study that we've cut our emissions on a per seat basis by half since 1990. So that's pretty great. And then the advances we've made in sustainable aviation fuel in the last 5 years are astounding. You probably don't even realize you've flown on sustainable aviation fuel if you've really flown out of LAX in the last few years, thanks to United's efforts, or out of SFOs now, thanks to JetBlue's, Alaska's, and American's efforts. We're bringing this low carbon fuel to the airport. And so, like, this is well established, certified, safe fuel. The technology is there. We need a real focus from our industry in terms of building that up. And then I think when we hit that place, then ultimately we can feel that, you know, customers can travel freely and not have to be so concerned about this. And I also think it's important from the customer perspective to be mindful of their impact. I not just in airlines, in any of the businesses that they work with, I strongly encourage anyone to research the competition, and specifically if that company is making a meaningful move on sustainability. As a sort of cheat sheet, if you're looking at an airline, if you see anything around sustainable aviation fuel, that means they're doing a lot. And ultimately, emissions targets as well, I think, is really credible. So I think it's just around using our dollars to support businesses that we see are in line with our values.
Great. Thanks, Sara. I appreciate that perspective and openness, you know, in terms of JetBlue and what the aviation industry is doing. And to everyone, really powerful examples. So thank you for sharing. At this point, Nick, check in. Do we have any questions from the audience?
We do. We have quite a few questions rolling in, so we'll try to get through these questions as thoroughly as possible. We've got about 15 minutes, 20 minutes left. We could go a little over if people want to stay. Since I'm here, I'll jump in and just hijack the first question because it builds a little bit on what, Sara, you were just alluding to. But you guys have all shared a lot of the different things that you are doing on behalf of your different organizations. But I'm wondering if you guys could just give us a quick outline, since there's a lot of colleagues, we have airlines, we have tour operators, we have everybody's an enthusiastic traveler on this call. What are your specific goals that each of your respective organizations are hoping to meet, be it climate neutrality, net zero, science-based targets, zero waste, that sort of thing? What are your specific goals, and when do you intend to meet them? And I guess we'll go with Sara, since you were, but, and then of course, yeah, thanks.
Sure. So, I mean, in theory, we have achieved domestic carbon neutrality through our offsetting that I spoke about. But we also, I mentioned that we're in the process of figuring out internal emissions specific goals that exclude offsets. And so, agreed, right now we have opted for domestic carbon neutrality. It is about 80% of our emissions, so we're most of the way there. And so that investment and focus is there. You mentioned science-based targets. That is something that we're also working toward as well. There is some separate work going on to make that applicable to the airline industry, since we have a very unique operation. And so I think that's something that our industry is working toward. But this, I love the question, because then I repeat this internally to my leaders and all of my internal stakeholders around, people want to know what we're doing now. And so these longer term aspirational goals are no longer enough. And so it drives companies like mine to get to make these really cool and meaningful targets. And I expect you'll hear more and more of them soon.
And just to answer that question, I suppose, from Lindblad's perspective, we have been in the expedition industry for a long time, and indeed started expedition travel to Antarctica. We're the first there. So with that comes an obligation, I suppose, to be leaders in the field or leaders in the industry. I must say I don't know much about the kind of finer details about our goals, our plans, but as a naturalist on board, certainly we're constantly upskilling, constantly meeting remotely to make sure that we have the best information to the places that we visit, sharing the latest scientific findings and seeing how we can constantly improve our message. And that's really been our goal from the very, very start, within the ethos of not damaging the places that we visit and of course the planet as a whole, but they're rather improving them and in changing people's perspectives on their place in the environment. So I can't speak about specific targets, but as a naturalist for the company, certainly we're constantly upping our game in terms of our message and the delivery of that message, and keeping our finger on the pulse with the latest findings and how they relate to the places that we travel and the animals and landscapes that we're interested in.
Yeah, we're at a very interesting precipice right now with sustainability, because a lot of the technologies that will allow us to have a lot of these benchmarks going forward are just now emerging. They're just coming to be commonplace. One of the world's first completely electric flight was, I believe it was last year. It was a small one of the Cub planes in Alaska, and like I would love to say, okay, going forward we are going to do every single one of our grizzly watching trips is going to be completely electric. I mean but it's as the technology emerges, we have to understand the data to know what's possible, what's expandable, et cetera, et cetera. But I think our biggest thing is that we had the privilege to be the world's first carbon neutral travel company back in 2007. Once again, when times were good, we had the ability, we did it, we didn't look back, and we've been ever since. And so as a result, our goal on that is not to become more carbon neutral, because we have been. It's not to go 1.1 times carbon neutral. It's to boldly influence the travel industry in general. It's to get other companies to look at this as an option. Even similar industries, like the airline industry. I think that as the culture changes through this whole shouting from the mountaintops thing, it becomes more normal, becomes more of a vocabulary, more fluency, and that's where we get big change. But as far as a specific thing we've been looking at, it has been zero waste. We started doing that, really looking concertedly in 2018, with our first trip being zero waste in 2019. And had this COVID not completely gotten in the way of some things, we would be rolling out very specific metrics of how much waste we are reducing our trips going forward. We have a whole plan in place. It has been rolled out for our current Yellowstone season. We're doing a couple trips here and there, but as far as a big bucket to look at, it is the waste. Like I said, 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions is just in the food that we don't eat. It's a big deal. It's a big issue. I think we should all collectively look at it, and that's our general big target going forward.
Fantastic. Court, you started mentioning, technologies, and a couple of folks in the audience have asked, what are some of the most exciting technologies and innovations that you are all seeing across the board that have real potential to decarbonize, the sector, but still need commercialization? Or, similarly, what are the breakthroughs that you in each of your positions perceive are necessary to really address future climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, carbon offsetting is, of course, it's one of the best examples because it's there, it's ready for us. It's usually way more affordable than people think. I mean, really, like look into it. You can offset your life for probably what it costs to get like a Netflix subscription. So it's very, very feasible and affordable. But then beyond that, of course, looking at electric vehicles like planes, I mean, that's like such a big opportunity, but gosh, that's going to be tough. I mean, I love to hear what Sara's saying about the fuel. I mean, that's the kind of stuff to support. Use your dollars, use your decisions. Electric safari vehicles is something we've been looking into. I won't go into the complexities of why that's tough, but you can imagine if you've ever been on an African safari and you've had to change a tire out in the middle of Botswana's Okavango Delta with lions walking around. I mean, the ability of, for Tesla to drone in a new battery to drop in the middle of Africa is like tough. These are Land Cruisers, Land Rovers that can be easily repaired, but nevertheless, it's not going to happen if you don't try it. So big things like that we are looking at certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, so from the aviation perspective, I mean, ultimately airplanes, like our industry is built on innovation. It's still, it's majestic in terms of thinking through what we accomplish. But ultimately, I think in recent years, it's been around fuel efficiency, and going forward, I think some of the technology shifts are game-changing low carbon alternatives. And so I talked a lot about sustainable aviation fuel. I like to speak about it a lot because it really is such a promising solution to fundamentally change the carbon intensity of the fuel we're flying on. But then, Court, you mentioned electric aircraft. I mean, that's further advanced than maybe many people may realize for short-term, for shorter range travel. And JetBlue we keep our pulse on changing technologies and disruptive technologies that exist. We have a subsidiary called JetBlue Tech Ventures based out in San Francisco, and they look for emerging tech in a number of spaces. One of their portfolio companies is one called Joby Aviation, and they're building short-haul electric aircraft. And so I think these are happening. There's a much bigger challenge when it comes to longer range aircraft in terms of, like, I think the aircraft would largely be all battery. So still some more work to come there. But Airbus yesterday came out with their proposals for zero emission aircraft. I think that could enter the market as soon as 2035. And so I think there's going to be some game-changing stuff. And I do think, especially, we always look at 2050 as this like must be net zero emissions across all industries. I think for aviation, we'll be there.
And to add to what Sara said, I mean, we operate on ships, but we can't get our ship to everybody's house, unfortunately, to pick everyone up. That would be great, but we do rely heavily on the airline industry. So we always have one eye on what we do and one eye on how the airline industry is becoming carbon neutral or attempting to reduce carbon footprint. So obviously we have a big interest in that as well. And what we do in the field is we bring people out in small boats to get closer to wildlife or icebergs or whatever the point of interest is. So we use these really rugged small boats that carry about 10 or 12 people. They're called Zodiacs. We crane them into the water, but the waters are frigid. So we've been testing and experimenting with the electric boats, electric engines, I should say, but they don't work well in frigid cold conditions. Also, they're quite heavy. So craning them off the top of a ship that's rolling in the waves, perhaps, or in windy conditions, gets more difficult when you add the weight of batteries. So, we continue to use our petrol engines until we can find something that's workable. So these are the kind of challenges in polar conditions, I suppose, that are quite specific. But as soon as it's possible, we're going to convert to electric or other alternatives as soon as that becomes safe and realistic and available.
Great, thank you. I've got quite a few questions coming in, and I'm going to throw a challenge one out to the panelists. So a question from Rachel: what is standing in the way of setting science-based targets aligned with a 1.5 degree trajectory, in addition to these longer-term, 2050 type aspirational goals? And how will you work with your stakeholders, to set these types of targets that might be a bit more ambitious?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I don't think much is standing in the way. I think we're far outweighing that. We're well beyond that. So really what we're thinking about is, okay, we're already doing kind of our own operations, our own trips. When you join a trip, you are now part of that. I think some of it comes in, frankly, to the marketing. If you like that terminology of 1.5, the science-based targets, and that's the language you use, then maybe we should be doing some more of that. But we do choose a little bit of different narrative, different stories. And I think more importantly, what I'm really after is changing changing the behavior, changing the thoughts, changing the ideas of our guests to then have them carry the torch into their own lives. And that's one of my big missions. So I'm also an expedition leader, and on each one of my trips, I make sure people understand what can they be doing when they get home. Sure, they joined one of the world's most sustainable trips. They're actually having a better impact on the environment by going, than staying home. But how can they perpetuate for the other, 340 days out of the year or whatever? And I think that's where I think there's bigger potential for change. So we haven't gotten into that 1.5 number, with individual guests, but nevertheless, we want to influence as much as humanly possible. But it's great feedback. If that's something that is getting more of like a common language and people understand it and digest that versus more common phrases like carbon neutrality or carbon offsetting, you'd be surprised how little people know about what offsetting and carbon neutrality are. We are in the process of making a 3-minute video that will probably double people's knowledge about it, just because it's still sort of a foreign concept. So to you, I think there's a lot we could do. For the average person, I think it's still kind of starting with a little bit of chapter 1.5.
Great. Any other?
Yeah, look, so a science-based target, of course, is setting a science-aligned, real significant goal, right, to align with the 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees of warming. And so I of course, right now, as a fossil fuel reliant industry, I want to set a target, of course, with a clear roadmap that we can meet. So right now we're bound by technology challenges, essentially what is available to us. And of course I have to put on the backdrop of this that airlines are in a very financial critical state. And so if I look at SAF, for example, which I keep speaking to, again, sustainable aviation fuel, in that it's a drop-in fuel that fundamentally reduces emissions by up to 80% and that we're flying on, we still do face a supply and cost issue. And so ultimately what happens is it's up to the individual airline to have this agreement. Well, they'll purchase a certain number of gallons, but given the reality of our financial situation, there's only a certain amount in terms of the premium that we can really justify right now and also keep ourselves going as a business. But I think when we hit price parity, so when it's the same price as conventional fuel, airlines will, of course, take as absolute much as we can. And then the market will completely be stimulated. And I think that'll address a lot of our problems and allow us to meet these much more aggressive targets. And so right now, I think there's a lot of policy measures that could be introduced that would lower that price premium between sustainable aviation fuel and conventional jet fuel. And some of it's a bit complicated, but some of the same feedstock that can make sustainable aviation fuel, also it can make renewable diesel, really for the ground and trucking industry. And there are just the incentives are simply better for that industry. So if I'm a producer making renewable fuel, I'm more likely to make renewable diesel than aviation fuel, simply because the incentives are better. And so, from the industry perspective, we're working with all of our stakeholders, but I do think that could be a game changer in terms of just leveling that out. And again, airlines, we are very committed to, the easiest and most effective means of reducing our emissions. And so I think with some real changes, I think we could get there.
And just quickly, because we're running low on time, I guess, on that one, but from Lindblad's perspective, I'm not sure if our targets are really that specific as a relatively small operation to try and meet those very specific targets, but that's where partnering with South Pole comes in, and we know those guys have the knowledge that we want to tap into, that we want to make sure we're investing heavily in offsetting. We just want to make sure that goes to the right place, and that's we rely on them to make those decisions and make sure their investments are sensible and getting to the place where they're having the best impact.
Great, thanks, Conor, and we're very honored to have that trust and to be partnering with you on that. So listen, in the 2 minutes we have left, we've gotten a lot of questions. Maybe perhaps this is the last one for a quick answer, but about clearly everyone on this call today are leaders and doing a fantastic job, setting the bar high, taking action. Fantastic, but how do you influence the industry at large? And unless the rest of the laggards and the really big players, particularly in aviation, jump on board as well, is it really enough if there are just a few leaders? So what are you all doing to nudge colleagues and peers and collaborate across the industry. And Sara, building on your last point, regulation obviously plays in there too, and how you can influence to get those policies.
Yeah, I'll keep this succinct. I like in my industry to give credit where credit is due. JetBlue was the first US airline to announce that we were voluntarily offsetting all of our emissions, but EasyJet did it first. And candidly, of course, this is something that we had in the works for a while, but when I see movement and I see leadership, that makes the conversation a little easier for us. And so we announced, and of course, I'm not taking credit for Delta's announcement, but after our announcement, Delta also made an announcement around achieving carbon neutrality. And so then, of course, we hit COVID and hit sort of a pause in some of these voluntary efforts, but that really does move things for our industry. In addition, now what I'm seeing is new targets that are short-term around emissions reduction. So Norwegian Air came out with one last week, and also Finnair has a significant one. And so I look to those, and that is meaningful, and that can help me as I do these same exercises for my company.
Great, thanks.
And to answer that one, I think, knowing our customers very well, they just have such a high demand for environmentally and ethically responsible travel that we just have to keep up with that demand. And, competition is good. There are several other expedition companies that are going to the same places. We just need to make sure that we are honest about our impact, and that we're open about how we are trying to reduce that and how we're good at reducing that, and just be honest with our customers and our guests, and to try and keep up with each other, and share technology in the similar way that we do with our navigation. For example, we share our soundings between the ships so that we're not going blind into places, and that benefits everyone, because that reduces the chance of oil spills or things like that. So there is there's already a good kind of community spirit in the industry, and I think we should continue to tap into that and share knowledge, and as technology becomes available, to lower our impact even further.
Yeah, that's great. So you lead. How do you do it? You lead the way, you lead the vanguard. You can come at it from a top-down approach as we the leaders, we the influencers, but there also has to be a bottom-up approach. The people have to demand it. They have to put their money where their mouth is. They have to encourage demand. When there are enough people paying for a certain thing and moving their monies to certain behaviors and activities like more sustainable stuff, you create a market trend. And what happens is the bigger companies have to protect their bottom line, and they might not care about sustainability, but all of a sudden they're losing business to the other guys because there's a market trend in that direction. So it has to be a two-way street for sure. Policy is not anything that gets immediately changed. You have to have a majority or close to it that push for that. And I think you lead the way, you do what you think is right, you shout from the mountaintops. You join 1 hour webinars during Climate Week, and you do this 50 to 100 more times in a month, and you got things going. You got people paying attention to you, and then as you grow as a business and just run a successful business, more people pay attention to you, and you have a bigger, better voice for what you think is right. So it's on the responsibility of a lot of folks, I believe.
That's great. Thanks, everyone. So Nick, I know we're 3 minutes over. Should we take a few more questions, stay longer if people can, or kind of wrap?
If the panelists are okay with it, we could go for a couple more. Let's do it.
Just need to move a quick meeting. Start with somebody else.
Thank you, Sara.
No problem.
Just don't move any flights.
All right. So one question we got, and this is probably something that you all could opine on for many, many minutes, but in brief, and I think a lot of people are wondering, a lot of medical institutions, the general public is concerned about a second wave as we enter the winter months in the Northern Hemisphere. How well is the travel industry prepared? And is there risk of this kind of, halting this momentum and this positivity that we have seen over the past few weeks? And, how does it influence your engagement over the next few months?
Sure, I'll jump into that one. Who knows exactly? I mean, the scientist in me says, well, second waves for things like this are, semi-inevitable. You look at the H1N1 of 1918, you look at the one from, previous years and previous centuries, and it's kind of there, but this is different. It's weirder. We had a different immediate reaction than some things in the past, so I can't 100% say it's going to happen or not. I think the travel industry in general is decently poised. I think the bigger outfits may be. I think the smaller outfits may not be. They just are not designed to have a war chest like that to weather the storm. Travel in general is not going anywhere because it's what we all seek. It's what we all work our whole lives for. It's the rainbow. It's the thing we're going for. So I think there will be a shakeup. There's already been a bit of a shakeup. I think if there's a double whammy of this, we're going to see just more delay, more rollover into the next year. But with that, I mean, I'm just an eternal optimist, so I kind of have to. I'm thinking this constantly, but nevertheless, that's just more pent-up demand. That just means if you can weather the storm 2022 or 2023 or whatever, they're going to have that much more demand in them. Travel is definitely not going anywhere. That I absolutely promise you. But we have to figure out what's going on in the meantime, and it's every day is a little bit different. If you're in the travel industry back in March, you know it was an hour by hour change. And gosh, if there's anything that's prepped us for more stormy weather, it's the last 6 months.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add on, obviously hopeful that that's not something that we experience, but I think we've also all learned so much in where risks lie and how to respond. I mean, I don't remember the exact month, but there was a time before airlines mandated that you had to wear a mask. And so I think we were the first airline to make that commitment, and it was a whole discussion. And even now there's still discussion around it, but at least, as there's more resolve around, these are the clear steps that we have to take so that we can potentially start to reopen in safe ways. I think that a second wave, at least we would have these lessons learned that we can bring into it.
And I think, in the expedition industry, it's a little bit like we have to learn from kind of national measures, I suppose. And as countries come out of lockdown, they don't do it all at once. They do it gradually and see how that goes. So a toe in the water, and that's what we're aiming for. To start up gradually again at the end of the year. But in the expedition industry as well, one thing we're very good at, we've been doing for decades, is contingency planning, because often the weather dictates what we do or where we go. And that's certainly what we've been doing. We've been looking at the various options as they open and close. And in the Northern Hemisphere, people going back to school and college, that will obviously have an effect. And we're watching those as well. But certainly we're going through all of our contingency plans and hoping we can do a slow start towards the end of the year.
Thanks, Conor. Speaking of contingency planning, a question from Tom that came in a few minutes ago. Looking back, is there anything that you wish, in hindsight, had been included in your resilience plans or risk management approaches for COVID?
I'll jump in. I probably should think about that more, but there's not a specific thing. I would say no. The biggest thing is get your house in order as much as possible. Make sure you're a tight knit company culturally, and also with your guests. It's a hard one to answer, but nothing, honestly, as like an advice kind of thing, nothing really comes to mind other than just know it's not a matter of if something like this happens, but when. It's the uncertainty. Like this, it's like a 500-year flood or whatever. I mean, you know it. There's a timeline on this kind of stuff. So just expecting it. But great question, though. I'd like to hear what everybody.
Mine's a similar answer. I mean, fortunately for us, big airlines have a department specifically who focus on emergency response and business continuity. And so while I am, of course, looped into different climate scenarios and risks associated with environmental and social pressures, I wasn't too closely involved in the planning process for pandemics. I mentioned earlier in this panel that was something that we have tracked. And so I know that we do prepare in some means. I don't expect anybody prepared for a scenario of this extent, but perhaps they have. But I think ultimately we learned a lot. And again, this will only inform the urgency in which we approach climate risk scenario planning, because the minute we are slightly more normal, I'm going right back to that group. And I think somebody mentioned earlier this being a dress rehearsal for climate change. I heard the CEO of Citi said that also, and that was really telling to me in that, look, there's going to be more things like this. What the next crisis might look like will likely be a little bit different, but it just makes so much more important our planning efforts.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's quite a tricky one to answer, but I think of the things that were in our control, they went quite well. But in every aspect of life, things just went out of people's control. But getting people home, relying on our contacts in the ports that we usually call into, relying on those connections and those good connections with colleagues in places that we operate, and going through all those contingency plans that I mentioned earlier. The difficult bit was, how different governments in different countries responded and reacted at different paces, and that was the challenge. But this is something that we can now look back to as an example and plan for. Hopefully, we won't see the likes of this again in the future, but it would be negligent not to plan for it, because if it happens once, it can happen again.
I will add one quick thing, just because I think I know the audience out there is, I bet one group that wishes they would have done things differently is those individual travelers that do not use travel agents and use tour operators. I can't tell you how many times I heard from guests that said, oh, had we had to reroute all these flights and get this visa and overnight in this country between and use this travel agent, had they not done that, they would have been in a different boat. So I think that there's going to be increased value, unlike we've seen before, even more increased value for assistance in travel planning because of these things.
That's a great point, Cord. And as a layperson who travels, the concept of travel insurance and travel agents has a whole new meaning to us now. So I think that's very true. One question, thinking about travel coming back at some point, optimistic on recovery, and this might be more for Court and Conor and your expeditions, are there certain places or areas or types of destinations where we shouldn't ramp up travel when you're thinking about sustainability? And how do you draw the line between, sustainable versus not sustainable travel for locations that might be more vulnerable or at risk?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Sorry, Conor, if you were going to go, but I'll be quick. I mean, I think the biggest thing in our mind is, because we are going to the quote unquote ends of the earth, is communities. I mean, if we are going to the remote areas of the Amazon and the like, I mean, we got to be sensitive to that. There probably are areas that we should be really thinking about, or if we're not already, we have to have even more protocols in place for sensitivity of introducing potential, COVID to remote tribes, remote regions, et cetera, et cetera. That's the thing on the first, on the front of my mind, just because of the situation we're in. But in general, I mean, yeah, I could probably talk at length about certain areas that are more susceptible to quote unquote over tourism. But I think the biggest thing is remote communities. But this is where I think part of the ingredient for any expedition travel company is to gauge the invitation that the host country provides us to get travel back going again.
And some of the places we visit, we're bringing the researchers with us to answer those very questions. And so, of course, we'd be, A, the first people to get that information, and B, the first people to react to it appropriately. And one of what we sell is experiences in extremely remote places. And if it feels like a zoo, then we're not going to go there. And so, the product is kind of, if it's changing, then we're not interested. And that's something that we're watching all the time. We want to get to places that are pristine and keep them pristine. It's in our own interest. And if we see someone who's operating in a way that's not keeping it pristine, then we're going to have something to say about that. And there's thankfully, with Antarctica as an example, the treaty that protects the entire continent, to keep it pristine and to keep it for not to be exploited. And we're under strict rules to make sure that we don't have an impact there. But yeah, I mean, back to the point I was making, if it doesn't feel remote and we're seeing big crowds there, then that's not the product we're interested in, and we won't be participating then.
I can add the 30 seconds from JetBlue, since I agree you two are the right to speak to it, though JetBlue is a little bit unique in our route map in terms of having a specific focus ocean conservation and sustainable travel. So we have this whole arm of our sustainability and ESG program, and I invite anyone to check us out on our website. But ultimately, understanding that 1/3 of the destinations we fly to are places in Latin America and the Caribbean. When travel was at a normal state, you know, a lot of our business was flying people from cold destinations like New York and Boston to beautiful places in the Caribbean for a nice getaway. And, you know, in the same way, I think, Conor, you mentioned that it's in our best interest for these places to be in good shape. Of course, we are not always that, you know, that's not our business approach to everything. But in addition to it being the right thing, agreed that when the, you know, the beach erodes and really the it's covered in trash, for example, then people are going to stop traveling there. And so even as a, you know, non-conservation major airline, we still absolutely have a focus and interest in keeping these beautiful places beautiful.
Fantastic.
Just
Thank you.
a quick add-on to that, if I may. In, you know, some of the places that we go to, more often than not, actually, we recycle, for example, the number of different recycled compartments that we have. We can't offload those to appropriate recycling facilities. So, you know, we're interested in the ports and facilities that we use in facilitating that we can recycle all the things that we separate out when we get to shore. So there can be a positive effect locally of that if those facilities are developed to cater for us. They're also going to be catering for locally as well.
It's a great point, a great example of that tangible impact. So at this point, 15 minutes over, I think we will wrap. Thank you all so much for your honest and mindful and really insightful answers, and to the audience for your questions and sticking around with us. Nick, I will pass it over to you to share a little bit more about our upcoming events.
Thanks a million, Muireann, and thanks to all of you for joining us. That was a terrific conversation. I got to be honest, it kind of makes me want to travel. We do have a few more events going on this week. You'll see those on the screen right now. You can also visit southpole.com/events. We will send a real quick follow-up email to everybody at some point next week, which will include a link to the recording of this presentation. You are more than welcome to share that as widely as you like. And you can also reply to that email if you do have additional follow-up questions for us or any of the panelists. We're happy to pass that along to you. So without further ado, if we were in a big room, we'd have a big round of applause. At this point, a virtual round of applause to our panelists. Thanks a million, and we will talk to you again soon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And here's where the here's where I can't remember how to turn it off. Hi, everybody. Thanks, guys.